I'm Karolyn Tyson, Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Broadly, my research interests are in educational inequality with a particular focus on race, culture, and schooling of Black students. So I've always been interested in questions about stratification and inequality in the U.S. in particular. And I became interested in education as a way to understand more about intergenerational poverty and the transmission of privilege and so forth and so on. And so I saw education as one way to begin to address questions of inequality, right? To the extent that schools are seen as the great equalizer, or at least that we have a narrative in the U.S. that we can reduce inequality, or at least that we can improve the lives of our individual citizens in the U.S. through schooling. And so that is how I became interested in looking at schools and why it was that we still have so much inequality, even though we have supposedly equal access to educational opportunity for all in the U.S. Understanding, for example, why we continue to see these, why there are these persistent and significant gaps in educational achievement and attainment by race and class. But I was particularly interested in the race piece. And then beginning to think about education in sort of a broad historical sense in terms of segregated education and then education post-Brown. And now that schools are desegregated, we expected to see more equality and more and better outcomes for minority children. And you know, we have seen progress, that's true, but there's also persistent gaps. And so trying to think about how it was that after desegregation, which seemingly removed some barriers to educational opportunity, then we see additional barriers after that. So now I'm particularly interested in tracking as one of the new forms of segregation in schools. My research is important because of the, I think, the national attention to achievement gaps. And it's one way of understanding, or at least beginning to think about how school structures, such as tracking, may be contributing to those kinds of gaps. So I think that research in the future, and I think that this is happening now, so I don't mean to imply that none of this is happening now, but I do think that there needs to be more attention to, and not necessarily only by researchers, but by policymakers as well, research inside schools that is more qualitative. That's the kind of research I do, but I see value in that because there's so much focus on just looking at test scores or doing more experimental research. And I think that there is value in understanding what the actual experience is like for students in schools.